we're talking about relationships of the romantic kind. Romantic relationships. So this would be dating and marriage types of relationships. But here's what we really believe. The principles that we're going to be talking about this morning are applicable in all types of relationships, from friendships to romantic relationships. It's not like patience only applies to marriage, right? If you've ever had a friend, you know you've had to be patient with them. So whether you're single, you're dating, or you're married, this is going to have something for you. I'm going to be picking up in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, reading from verses 4 through 13. But I want to give us an idea of what we're going to be looking at. So Paul is writing a letter to the Corinthians. And in this letter, he is writing with an explanation of what love should look like, what love should be like, how we demonstrate love. And just prior to him writing this and picking up in chapter 13, what he's talking about is spirituality and how it should not outweigh love. You see, the people at this time were prioritizing their spirituality over their love. And what Paul is encouraging is that you can't just look spiritual. You have to actually be and do loving things. And our spirituality should never outweigh the type of love that we can show one another. And he writes sort of what I call a to-do list. I like to-do lists. He writes a bit of a to-do list for how we are to show love. So read with me, beginning in verse 4. It says, "Love is patient and kind. Love does not envy or boast. It is not arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice at wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never ends. As for prophecies, they will pass away. As for tongues, they will cease. As for knowledge, it will pass away. For we know in part and we prophesy in part. But when the perfect comes, the partial will pass away. When I was a child, I spoke like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I gave up childish ways. For now, we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I have been fully known. So now, faith, hope, and love abide, these three, but the greatest of these is love." Let me pray. Jesus, we thank you for this morning, and God, we thank you for the opportunity that we have to gather in this place. And God, I pray that you would speak to us today, that our romantic relationships would honor you, that your great love would be reflected in our homes and in all of our actions toward one another. In your name, Jesus, we pray. Amen.
That was like a magic trick. Hey, guys. You ever wanted something, like really bad, like you saw something and you thought you wanted it, and in fact, you thought you wanted it more than you actually wanted it, and the only way that you discovered how bad that you wanted that thing was to encounter somebody else that wanted that thing even more. And like, I wanted it until I met somebody that like really wanted it, right? Now this is how I feel every year when Black Friday comes around. Now, how many in here come on, be honest, you are a Black Friday shopper? Let me see your hand. Keep your hand up, You're a Black Friday shopper. Okay, keep your hand up. We want to judge you a little bit. We want to look around and like just judge you and think things of you. And now I've had some friends, man, that Black Friday is like a sport. It's a sport. They're like looking for deals. And I remember one year, Christina and some of her sisters and some of her family were going to go out and they were going to do Black Friday shopping. And I was like, I don't want to be the guy that misses out. I don't want to be the person that misses out on something and doesn't have a story to tell. So I was like, I think I'm going to do Black Friday shopping. I was like, because there's some things that I want. There's some things that, that I'd love to get some good deals. And by the way, most of these, right, the purpose is to buy Christmas presents for other people. None of you are doing that when you're Black Friday shopping. That's not what you're doing. You're getting like a plasma TV for like $4.17. That's what you're trying to do, right? And I was like, I think I want to do this. However, I did something that changed my whole mind. I Googled Black Friday shopping videos. you want to see some stuff, like you want to save on some UFC fights once a month, you can just Google Black Friday shopping moments. And it's unbelievable to see people go into a Walmart or go into a Target or go into some other sort of store and go in there. And next thing you know, people are fist fighting for like an electric toothbrush. I don't know if it's worth it, man. I don't know if it's worth it. It's like I thought I wanted something until I saw some people that really wanted something, right? In fact, this is why when I was a kid, I never liked Easter egg hunts. Now, there are two types of kids. There are Easter egg hunt kids and there are non-Easter egg hunt kids, okay? Now, let me see your hand. You were an Easter egg hunt kid. You were that kid. You loved them. Yeah, put your hand down. Let me see your hand if you were like me. I'm not into it. I'm not vibing it. I'm not feeling the whole thing. I'm not into any of it. I'm gonna teach my kids to hate Easter egg hunts. I'm gonna program them, right? I didn't like it because I would get there and I'd be ready. Now, I'm kind of a germaphobe. You know this if if you've been coming to our church for a while, you know this about me, and I just don't like the whole vibe. And again, there's a couple different types of people. There's people that have the chip and people that don't have the chip. Like, for example, like people that don't have the chip jump on trampolines. People that have the chip jump on trampolines, but we jump like this. You're like, don't double bounce me, kind of type of people, right? We have some interns, like Ethan over here, who hangs with me, is hanging with me this year. He's one of our second-year interns. He doesn't have that chip. Like, he doesn't have that chip. Like, I'll see Insta story videos of him. In fact, I just saw this last week. I see Insta story videos of him. He like is on this board and he's being pulled by like a little tractor thing, and he's on the edge of a lake and he's just cruising. Like, no chip. Don't have the chip, right? Some of you, like, you'll jump from roof to roof. No chip. Like some of you just don't have, if you own a motorcycle. No chip. Like you just don't have that chip. Whatever that chip is, like when God was creating you, you got skipped, okay, right? And so for me, I remember showing up to Easter egg hunts and like those kids with no chips would show up. The kids that don't have those chips. Like for me, it's like, man, I'm just trying to chill, stay away from me. Let me just grab the egg and let me groove. Like, I just want like 5 eggs. Like, let me do my thing. But then the kids with no chip would show up and it was like martial law, right? They would show up and it was insane. So I just don't like those anymore. Why? Because I wanted some Easter eggs. But I just didn't want them as bad as that person wanted them. See, I think sometimes in our relationships, I think what we communicate and what we do are two different things. I've never met somebody that says, I don't want to have a great marriage. Never in my life. I've never met somebody and said, I'd like a mediocre marriage. Right? I never met somebody that's like, I want to date somebody that's meh. I've never met that person. I've never met somebody that is longing for mediocre relationships, and yet what do we have time and time again? We have mediocre relationships. Because the goal isn't just saying, I want this, it's, but how bad do I really want this? Like, how much of myself am I willing to sacrifice? How much of my own desires am I really willing to die to in order to do the work that it takes to have the relationship that I desire? There's a difference between wanting something and desiring something so much that it drives all that you do. See, Jesus said this. In fact, I say this at every wedding I do. I always talk about this moment where Jesus looked at a rich young man and he said this. He said, what good would it be to gain the whole world and yet forfeit your soul? Well, what an important question, right? Like, what good would it be to gain the whole world and yet forfeit your soul? And the reason why I share this at marriages is because I tend to think of it in this way, is that really, like, the soul of who I am, it's a part of it is my home. A part of it is, man, when I go home, like what's the vibe? What's the culture? What's the peace in my home? What does that look like? And I always think, what good would it be to gain the whole world? To be great in work, to have maybe some friends, to make money, but my home life is in disarray. What good would it be? In fact, many of us in this room, we've had those kind of moments where, man, you're killing at work, but then like things just aren't quite right, and you go home. And you know what I've discovered? Even when things are doing great out here, if my home is not right, I can't even enjoy it. And conversely, there's been other times and other seasons in our life where I feel like out here, everything else external, we're going through like hell and it's crazy, but there's peace in my home. And I gotta be honest, I can get through this. Why? Because, man, there's peace in my home. What, and how devastating it would be for you and I to be great at things except for the things that really matter. See, I don't want to be great at things. I just don't want to be great at things to be great. I want to be great at things that really, really matter in and through my life. You know, Christina and I get sometimes the awesome opportunity to do weddings. I enjoy doing weddings. I don't do as many as I used to. I have to say no a lot because I feel like we have multiple people getting married every single weekend. Like, if you're looking for somebody, you're like in the right place, man. In fact, if you're single in this room, just go ahead and lift up your hand. You're just single, lift up your hand, look around. Okay, put your hand down, Go ahead. I gave you a shot. You can't say I never did anything for you. I gave you a shot, right? But we get to do weddings, and one of the things that I always find interesting is that during the wedding, right, there's this point where we exchange vows. And what we do is we make promises in those moments. Right? We make declarations. We say that I'm going to commit to serve you, and I'm going to commit to love you and cherish you. I'm going to commit to be with you in times of good and bad. And at the very end, what do the people say? Right? If you agree with all this, say, I do. The person says, I do. But it's always interesting to me that in relationships many times, especially in a marriage, right, the longer you're married, is that at some point we go from I do, which is a declaration of my commitment, to you do, which is a declaration of my expectation of you. See, early on it's I do and I promise, and then somewhere it shifts. At some point it moves from a declaration of my commitment to you to my declaration of my expectation of you. I think you and I got to be really careful when we're living like that, because here's my point. My only point today is this, is that our best relationships will take place when our primary focus is on what we bring to the table. Our best relationships will take place when our primary focus is on what we bring to the table.
And in thinking about bringing our best to the table, it's interesting as you read these passages that Paul is writing. Sometimes we read them and we think of these love to-do list items as adjectives, meaning that they're descriptors for what love should look like. But when Paul's actually writing this, every single one of them is written in the original context as a verb, meaning these are things that love must do. These aren't just things that I'm being, but things that I'm doing. And I think sometimes we just have to do things in order to become them. So we may just choose today, I'm going to be patient, I'm going to be patient, I'm going to be patient. And then all of a sudden we become a patient person. And so Paul's emphatically encouraging us and giving us this roadmap for what love does to actually take these things to heart. So if you look at verse 4, it says, love is patient and kind. Love does not envy or boast. It is not arrogant. I think it's interesting that Paul chose to start with patience. I think he knew something about humanity. I think he knew something about love. The fact that he would start with patience. And now, Paul's writing about something more than just being patient in traffic, more than just being patient with that child that just will not listen, more than being patient but with everyday inconveniences of life. He's actually writing about putting anger far away, being so patient that we remain steadfast regardless of how hot the fire gets. That we put anger away and we choose to allow it to subside. And I think sometimes we think of patience in terms of love as, well, I am the potter, my spouse is the clay. Therefore, I will mold and shape them into exactly who I want them to be, and they just need to be patient with this process. When that's never what God intended, there is but one potter, his name is God. We are not the potter, and our spouse is not the clay. And unfortunately, we tend to approach a relationship with a to-do list of what we want our spouse to turn into rather than appreciating who they actually are. And see, love waits patiently on the one it's love. And there is a timing that is involved within this. There is a timing that is appropriate for God's appointed work. And oftentimes we want to help God encourage the character in our spouse by, don't worry, God, I got this. I'll get them there quicker than you will. And we'll hammer away like a nail at a head. And guess what? Nagging doesn't work. We have to be... Sometimes we think it works, but it doesn't. Nagging doesn't work. Moving on from patience, Paul also tackles kindness. That's the loudest amen I think I've ever gotten in church. Paul then talks about kindness. He talks about how love must be kind. And in the original language, he's talking about something that's so powerful, it breaks through any anger and any resentment. Now, I really have worked on patience, but I don't know a kind of patience that breaks through all anger and all resentment. But that's literally what he's talking about here. He says love is to not be arrogant, envious, or boastful, meaning not our own inflated idea of self-importance or making ourselves more important than others, but actually making that significant other more important than ourselves. And I think sometimes in this passage too, we see that Paul is saying that we don't choose self-seeking or self-serving behaviors, meaning that we don't choose to do things just to get attention. We don't choose to do bad behaviors just to get attention. Like, have you ever engaged in the silent treatment, thinking that that's going to really help? Like, not communicating about what's going on. He's saying to not engage in these kinds of behaviors, like ignoring the other person or creating a fight merely to get attention. We have to choose to lay down our fleshly desires that would cultivate a desire for that kind of attention, and to say, I'm going to prioritize the love that I have for my spouse and put them in front of and above me. Then in verse 5, it says, love is not rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It is not rude. It does not insist on its own way. And it is not irritable or resentful. Now, Paul, when he's writing this passage about being rude, it's interesting because he's talking about an appropriateness that we have to possess in our relationships. An appropriateness by not engaging in rude acts, so far as to not interrupt the other, not elbowing our way into a conversation, or trying to, again, self-serve my interests. He says we're not to monopolize the relationship just for what I want, but we're to put their needs in front of our needs. He says it doesn't insist on our own ways. Now, this one I really believe is at the heart of every single relational conflict, because we want our own way. From the very beginning of time, we have a me type of thinking, a me type of mentality that says what's mine is mine. And so that's why when you get into a relationship, one of the things that it reveals first is the ugliness of our selfishness. It shows us of how often and how frequently we're selfish. That's why when Andrew's talking about moving from I do to you do, this happens really quick. I remember when we got married in Jamaica 13 years ago, and Andrew had picked out our place in the DC area. I had never seen it. So we go from our honeymoon. I'm moving from Alaska. We get married in Jamaica, and I end up in DC, and he's so excited to show me the new place. And mind you, I had just said I do days before, and we're walking around the place. And guess what my primary thought is when we walk into our bedroom and I see there's one closet? So how's this gonna work? From I do to you do. You take less closet space, and I'll take the rest. We move so quickly from what I'm giving to what I'm getting, because that's the kind of selfish, innate desire that we all possess. But love doesn't insist on its own way. Love gives your spouse the bigger closet. It isn't irritable or resentful. It isn't irritable or resentful. Now, I actually kind of pride myself on not being a naturally very irritable person. Like, I think I naturally am very patient, but over the past 7 months, that has changed a little bit, and there's this thing called pregnancy hormones that I think have led to me being maybe irritable just like once or twice, maybe. Yeah, no, yeah, I've been irritable a lot. And unfortunately, Andrew's gotten the brunt of that irritability. And it's taught me that when Paul's talking about not being irritable or resentful, that some of us need to adopt, myself included, the fastest response, I'm sorry. Yeah. Please forgive me. Yeah. It's not going to happen again. I got your back. choosing the kinds of language that admit to fault more quickly. Now, this goes against everything that we have innately within us because of our sinful fallen nature. But if we can choose to adopt that kind of language, it would really go far with our relationships. In verse 6, says, love does not rejoice at wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth. I think rejoicing in wrongdoing is one of the quickest ways to sabotage a relationship. Rejoicing in wrongdoing, and here's how this can play out. Rejoicing in wrongdoing can play out in sarcasm, negative talk, telling your spouse, you'll never do this, you'll never become this, you never type of language. I remember when back in that same place where I was concerned about the closet, Andrew was putting together a bookshelf, and this was in like the first month of marriage, and I remember struggling with this bookshelf, and I was like, oh, I got it, and I couldn't figure it out, he couldn't figure it out, but I started laughing at the fact that it couldn't be figured out. And I came from a very sarcastic family that was always making fun and poking fun at inadequacies and things that weren't getting done right. And I realized in that moment that if I'm going to choose to bring my best to the table every single day of my relationship, that can't involve negative talk. It can't involve sarcasm. It can't involve rejoicing in wrongdoing or laughing at a bookshelf not being built. In fact, it has to involve positive talk, positive encouragement, focusing on the good that's in the person that I'm with and not the negative of who they are. And I think of it as like a riverbank that can be eroded underneath by the water that's running beneath it, that so erodes at the relationship that eventually the bank that's above it caves in. I saw this again and again and again where I lived on a river in Alaska. The water was constantly eroding, and that's what negative talk, that's what sarcasm, that's what a lack of belief in your spouse does. So rejoicing in wrongdoing is one of the quickest ways to kill a relationship. Verse 7 and 8 says, love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never ends. I love the word usage here, bears all things. The word there, bear, B-E-A-R, is actually addressing covering. So that word actually can be replaced with covering, meaning that I'm not just bearing, putting up with my spouse, I am covering and caring for my spouse. About a year ago, we had Hurricane Irma that came through, and our children's pastor, Emily, and her husband, Jet, had a tree collapse in on top of their roof. And as a result, the roof caved in and water was seeping in, and so a storm all night led to a lot of water damage. Well, I think of our relationship with our significant other like that roof. What Paul's talking about is a covering that cares for the wants, that cares for the desires, that cares for the heartbeat of my spouse, that cares for what they desire. Or I can choose to say, you know what, whatever your inward or outward desires are, you deal with it. I'm not going to be covering for you any longer. But what Paul's saying is, no, in a loving relationship, we cover and we care for one another, and we believe in their dreams more than they even do at times. We hope for their dreams more than they even do at times. We care for the heartbeat of the relationship and for their personal heartbeat. Believes all things and hopes all things. And now this isn't naively believing anything that you're told, but having faith and belief that what God spoke over you and that relationship, God will not fail. That you and your spouse, you hope for that, you believe for that, and no matter what happens in and through that relationship, you continue to contend for that, never neglecting what God spoke, because if he said it, he's going to do it, and clinging to that regardless of what situation can arise. And then he says, endures all things. Love is not fragile. Cannot be fragile. It cannot be a breakable bond. Endurance means going the distance, withstanding the test of time, lasting, and continually giving as an ongoing action. But here's the reality, endurance doesn't mean an escape from pain. There's nobody in the world that can hurt me more than Andrew, because there's no one in the world I love more. We cannot allow just one momentary instance of pain to go, oh, I'm out, and bounce. And then he says, love never ends. There is no expiration date on love. And so often we desire the benefit of a relationship without the sacrifice that it takes to make it work. And what Paul's emphatically encouraging us here is to choose love, to choose to love, and to choose to focus on what we're giving and not what we're gaining, to bring the best to the table in every single instance. There was a time when in our kitchen we were working at a little whiteboard in our kitchen, and Andrew, myself, and his best friend Tyler were at this whiteboard. And it was talking about how do you know who you're supposed to marry? And I had this built-up idea of like a princess, a Disney princess type of love where, it's a feeling. And all of a sudden I'm going to feel that you're my Prince Charming, and that's how I'm going to know because it's with one person in the whole world, and you're my Prince Charming. And Andrew said, well, no, I chose you. And I was so offended because I didn't want to just be chosen. I wanted it to be the fairy tale princess. But what I've learned throughout 13 years of marriage is that feelings are fickle. Feelings are fickle, and if I'm building my relationship on a feeling, there's going to be days I feel like being married and days I don't. But if my feeling is being able to dictate my relationship and my marriage, that means when the going get tough, I get going. But Paul's saying, no, we choose love. We choose a love that endures, and that regardless of what happens, I choose this relationship. And just because feelings are fickle doesn't mean I have to cave in a moment where a feeling is absent.
That's right. That's great. That's great. I want to have the band come up. I'm going to finish, but I have like 4 closings, so don't get too excited. I love verse 11, because the Apostle Paul says this, and I think a lot of us can relate to this. He says, when I was a child, I spoke like a child, I thought like a child, I reasoned like a child, but when I became a man, I gave up childish ways. You see, so much about growing up is having a healthy understanding of what other people are supposed to provide for you. For example, like when I was growing up, right, my parents did things for me when I was 5 years old and 6 years old. And what they did for me when I was 6 years old and what they were doing for me when I was 15 years old was different. And what they were doing for me when I was 16 years old and what they were doing for me when I was 25 years old, it changed. And the older I got, the expectation that I had on them, like I don't expect my parents to pay my bills right now. It'd be nice, right? But I don't have that expectation. Now, does that stop them from being my parents? Does that stop? No, they're still my parents. But as I mature and as I grow, my expectation and my need for them and what I need from them changes. And so when we're talking about growing up, it's not just about, usually when we think of growing up, we think of that person needs to grow up and they need to do X, Y, Z. But I think sometimes a part of us growing up in this room as it pertains to our dating relationships, our marriages, and really all of our relationships, is a part of growing up is me growing up and going, how are my expectations of other people changing as I get older? And am I still expecting you to provide things that you cannot, nor are you meant to provide for me? Like in the greatest relationships, in the greatest of marriages, I'm grateful to stand up on the stage with clarity of conscience to say, man, I love my wife. We have a phenomenal marriage. And even in the best relationships and in the best marriages, that person that you're married to is only going to be able to really supply about 75% of what you need. Even in the best relationships. Even if you're doing great right now, that person that you are with cannot provide everything that you need. So you and I got to grow up. We got to shift our expectation. And so I think growing up means a few things. Number one, growing up means you focus on the things that really matter. Growing up means you focus on the things that really matter. Come on, you ever been in a fight with somebody? And then sometimes it's your spouse. And then like after 4 hours of fighting, you're like, what are we even fighting about? I don't even remember what we were fighting about, right? Growing up means I'm gonna really focus on the things that really matter. Another thing that growing up means your expectations are realistic. Growing up means your expectations are realistic. Again, it's that 75% rule. By the way, can I just encourage you, like no matter where you're at on the spectrum, your spouse needs friends, so let them have them. They need friends. They need friends. They need hobbies. Your spouse needs hobbies. You know, that was one thing as Christina and I kind of grew in our relationship. I think early on, and sometimes this just, people never grow out of this, it is, we don't want to think that something else can give our spouse life. Right? So we want to think that we are the source of life. I don't know what that was, but you know what I'm saying. Like we want to think we are it, but the reality is, listen, probably when your spouse goes and works out, that probably gives them some life. right? It probably, when they're hanging out with their friends, it probably gives them some life. And so growing up means that you and I have realistic expectations of our spouse. Here's another thing that growing up means. Growing up means you communicate yourself fairly and clearly. Some of y'all still fighting like you're 14 years old. Growing up means communicating yourself fairly and clearly. Fairly and clearly. Communicate yourself. I can't tell you how many times, and I know this because I know this about myself, right? You win 100% of the debates that you have when you're the only one having them. Come on, are you ever in the shower and you're like debating and you're playing their role and your role? Just me? Okay, cool, right? I've never lost one of those debates. I'm undefeated, right? And so what happens, check this out, what happens is you've been fighting with your spouse for a long time, they just don't know it. Because you haven't communicated yourself clearly. You haven't said what you need. You've just been having all these by yourself conversations, things in your head. And so you gotta communicate yourself fairly and clearly. And then finally, this is a big one. Growing up means you give what you want. Growing up means you give what you want. You give what you want. If you want a more sacrificial relationship, be more sacrificial. If you want a more generous relationship, be more generous. Whatever you want out of the relationship, here's always a great question. Am I what I want other people to be? Is that what I am? I was talking to somebody a while back, and I was talking to this lady, and she said that she had stopped at our church, but she didn't like it. And I'm like, okay, tell me why, right? What did John do, right? So she didn't like it. I said, why not? She goes, because I walked in and nobody said hi to me. And I'm like, okay, I'm thinking in my head, I don't know if I believe you, because to come to our church, you got to say hi to like 14 people before you get in the door. If you show up on time, there's gonna be 14 people. Hi, 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 hi. Like that's just our church, right? I went, oh man, I'm so sorry. That's really not our heart. Our heart is to be hospitable. Our heart is, yeah, we want to be generous. We want to be kind. We want to be loving. We want to be accepting. I'm so sorry. I go, who did you say hi to? Well, nobody. Okay. What I've learned about life is you give what you want. That's just what I've learned about life is you give what you want. Can I encourage you, if your relationship starts, give what you want. Like what do you want? And are you giving what you want? And then it goes on in verse 12. This is amazing. He says, for now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I've been fully known. So now faith, hope, and love abide, these three, but the greatest of these is love. Now some of you might be looking at verse 12 and you might be going, what does that have to do with my relationship? For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I have been fully known. The other day we got upset because GPS couldn't find us. You ever get mad at GPS? You're like, find me, you know what I mean? Like, you know, and we were upset at GPS because we were trying to press something in, and it didn't know where we were. It couldn't find us, and I'm like, man, what's the use of GPS if it doesn't know where I'm at? We hate this because we can't move forward until we know where we are at. Here's why sometimes maybe you can't move forward, because you forget that you are married with somebody, or you are dating with somebody, or you are working with people that currently right now on this side of death, right? Before we go to heaven, we are all looking in a mirror dimly lit. All of us in this room. Here's another way of saying it. We're all imperfect. We're all imperfect. None of us are perfect. You will never ever be married to a perfect person. You'll never find, in a dating relationship, a perfect person. But that's what we're trying to do. And it says that right now we see in a mirror dimly lit. The person that you're with, they see in a mirror dimly lit. And so here's what you got to do. No matter where you are at in your relationship right now, here's what you have to do. You got to do everything you can to figure out where you're at right now in your relationship. Where are we, and how can we go to the next level? What does that look like? We need to GPS this thing. Where are we at right now? Right? Where are we at right now, and how can we take this thing to the next level? Many years ago, and honestly, this is where oftentimes I lead conversations if I'm talking to spouses. And I remember years and years ago when I was on Seventh Church in the Seattle area, I was talking to a guy who just couldn't get over the fact of something that his wife had done, and he just couldn't shake it. And I've since communicated this to people because I think it's important. You got to know where you're at. And I was sitting down with this guy, And he's just so frustrated. He goes, man, I just can't get over it. I can't let it go. I just can't shake it. I said, well, do you want your marriage? He goes, I just don't know, because I don't love my wife. Like, that's not the woman I married. And I said, well, can you love your wife as a wife right now? And he looked at me, he's like, no, honestly, I really can't. I just can't. I said, okay, well, can you love your wife as a friend? Can you love your wife as a friend? Can you look at her just like you would love a friend? Can you love her as a friend? And he says, no, man, I feel like we lost all that. I said, okay, well, can you love your wife as an acquaintance? Right? Like somebody that maybe you just bumped into at Starbucks. Can you love your wife as an acquaintance? And he says, no, man, because I know too much. I said, okay, well, can you love your wife as your enemy? Because the Bible says that we are to love our enemies. You are here. And so if you got to start here, then you need to muster everything you can. And you need to stir up the gift of faith and go, wherever I'm at right now, God has called me to love. And the question that you and I need to ask ourselves is that in our most intimate relationships, does it reflect the glory of God? Does it speak to the nature of God? Does it speak to how forgiving, how loving, how kind, how gracious, how accepting, how forbearing he is? Does it speak to who God is? Come on, church. I want Grace City to be filled with people that have relationships that says, man, our relationships speak to the goodness of God. Speak to the kindness of God. Speaks to the forgiveness of God. Speaks to the love of God. That's what we want. And can I just tell you, it's not gonna happen without some work. It's not gonna happen without some, man, how can I serve? What if right now the people that are next to you, what if you said, hey, let's have a new competition? This is something Christina and I do all the time. Hey, I'm gonna outserve you, and I'm competitive, so I'm gonna win, no doubt about it. If it's a game of outserving you, I am going to outserve you. You are not gonna beat me at serving. You're not gonna beat me at loving. You're not gonna beat me at sacrificing. You're not gonna beat me. Come on, what if your whole goal was to outserve one another? Also want to encourage, speak really quickly. I know I said it in a joke, but I want to speak real quickly to the single people in the room. Single people, honestly, we have a lot of single people in our church. It's funny, somebody like tweeted at me like a little while back, and they're like, when are we starting a singles ministry? I'm like, we have one every Sunday, 9:30, 11, 12:30, 4:30, 6 o'clock. Single people, don't arouse love before it's appointed time. Don't be in a hurry. Don't be in a hurry. Don't be in a hurry. Stop comparing your life to the person on your right and left. I have great friends that have amazing marriages that got married when they were 35, got married when they were 40, got married when they were 25, got married when they were 22. If you're in this room and you had some debris in your past and you're going, man, am I ever gonna find somebody again? Stay faithful. It's all good. God's got you. He sees you. He loves you. Don't be overly discouraged. I know sometimes you might have even been afraid to come to this message here because you're like, oh, yeah, they're gonna preach and I'm sitting here and, right? God has something for you. Don't let the enemy whisper in your ear. Don't allow yourself to think loneliness. Come against that in the name of Jesus Christ. And if you're in this room and you're in a dating relationship or you're married, come on, guys, let's fight for the things that matter most. What a shame it would be to be great at a lot of things except for the things that really matter. And I think if we can start doing that, man, I'm telling you, we can make a difference in our city. Let's stand to our feet, Grace City Church.